welcome to our Kairos Network church webinar series. We've been doing these webinars as a way to help during one of the most unusual crises anybody has ever seen in their lifetime. Who would have ever thought just 3 months ago that we would have been completely closing down not just our country, but the world, and figuring out how to do church remotely. And now trying to figure out how we bring people back together. And in this series, I'm really excited because probably one of the biggest fears we had in all of this was, oh no, if we can't gather together in person, how are we going to collect an offering? And if we can't collect an offering, how are we going to be able to continue moving forward as the church? And so that's why I am so glad that we have this opportunity to hang out with Jan. Jan Engkasser is a community faith director with the Thrivent organization. But what I love in your bio, you are a self-described church nerd.
Indeed.
Now, Jan, could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do with Thrivent and what you're seeing in the local church in this season?
Certainly. So at Thrivent, I handle a number of different areas of responsibility. Part of that is our financial education portfolio. So the resources that we take out into the Christian community to help do everything from teach kids money values, to help people think through issues related to retirement and Social Security, how to build a budget, and so on. And I'm also responsible for work that we do in engaging with the Christian community. And so I'm the official church geek for the company. And so I do a lot of my time is spent looking at research about the Christian community and understanding trends and instances of things that are happening so that I can help keep the organization as a whole informed of things that are impacting the community that we seek to serve.
And so we're now 10 weeks in. Or we're at least, I'm in New Jersey, so we're 10 weeks into being closed down. A lot of people are. The initial shock, I think, has worn off when it comes to the church and finances. But what are some of the trends that you're seeing in the church when it comes to church finances as we're 10 weeks in?
I think I'd look at this through two lenses. So one would be through the lens of the institution of the church, and then the other lens would be through the individual Christian. And so what happened, organizations like Barna and others had been doing research where they've been asking questions about financial health for individuals prior to COVID-19 coming along. So in November of last year, they asked how individual Christians were doing financially. And at that time, there was about a third of people who were saying that they were struggling. So we already knew that there was a core group of people that were wrestling with their financial situation, having a hard time making ends meet. And then from that, fast forwarding into April of the current year, there's a third of people who would actually say they are significantly struggling with their finances. So it's not just a matter of them dealing with some of the hiccups along the way of, can I stretch my paycheck? But there are significant burdens that are hitting them that are related to this. We don't have an opportunity to compare and contrast that third against the third, prior, so how much more significantly is that hitting? But we do know there's a large number of people who are inhabiting our Christian spaces who are wrestling with the financial impacts of this. Some of that's related to job loss, some of that's related to income shrinking, as well as other expenses that may be changing as a result of all of this. And so we're also seeing people concerned about managing their expenses. So anxiety around managing expenses for individual Christians is skewing upwards as well, the farther we move into COVID-19. Now, on the church side, we already had a sense that churches back in March of this year, that we've got about 28% of them that were saying that they were experiencing some sort of hardship as a part of the impacts of this current circumstance that we're in. And we've also been seeing that for a lot of churches, that they weren't really prepared for this as well. So in the work that we do with individual Christians, we always talk about having an emergency savings fund.
Mm-hmm.
And what a lot of people are discovering is that churches didn't have an emergency savings fund. And so if you don't have those reserves in place, then it makes it
I think
difficult.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think a lot of times churches kind of operate as being college broke. You know what I'm saying? Where you have kind of just enough money to make it through, but if anything changes, you're going to be in big trouble. So how and you probably don't have stats on like the landscape, but I know for a small segment of churches, there's probably been like actually an increase year over year, which I think was definitely unexpected. But from what you guys have seen, you're saying the majority of churches aren't necessarily in that boat.
Exactly. Well over 3/4 of churches are struggling. It's a small segment that are actually doing better. But that being said, it's also a matter of degree. So in some places that's being felt differently. So what we know is that if your church is small, you're probably having greater struggles. If you are a church of color, you're probably having greater impacts there as well. And interestingly, if you are a rural church, you're probably not doing as badly as others. So urban churches and suburban churches are struggling more than rural churches are, as you look at some of the data.
That's really interesting. So when it comes to serving our congregations, because I think, sometimes when we talk finances, we forget, the reason we're collecting these finances is because of the ministry we're doing. And you shared some really interesting insights into what people really need in this time, because I think the financial question really begins with how can we best serve our people? And then the finances kind of follow behind doing the ministry of the church. Where is it you see the greatest need within the church and within people?
And so this was another Barna piece that was done, and when they took a look at where people are needing help, and they had a variety of categories. 72% of people, though, said where they're really needing help right now is in emotional support. And I think that's really significant. So as you look at the totality of the individuals that you're serving through your local congregations, there are certainly people who are finding it hard to stretch paychecks to be able to get food on the table, who might be facing issues related to can I pay the rent and so on. But 72% of people need some element of emotional support. And this is in some ways, a piece that just leans right into what churches are awesome at doing. Leaning into that space. And so how we think about the ways that we show up to help people navigate through this time, to be a source of comfort and hope and promise that helps lead them through. That's a critical piece that people are looking for right now. And I think churches are incredibly well suited to deliver that.
I think it's huge that you share those stats, because I think sometimes too, churches can feel like, I know there's a lot of need out there, but what can we do? And, the fact that you show, 72% of what people really are craving right now is right in the wheelhouse of the average American church, I think is an incredible thing. And it's a reminder of just how essential the church is in seasons like this. And so I think when we're talking finances in the church, sometimes pastors' eyes go cross because they're like, I didn't get in this to, be about budgets and finances and things like that. But really what we're saying is, how can we make sure that we're keeping the church moving forward well financially, so that we can be in the place people need us to be when they need us to be there. And so what would you say it is? Because when I break down church finances, I think there's kind of two components, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's income, which is how does the church bring in, for lack of a better term, revenue? And then there's expenses. What are the expenses? And so when it comes to revenue, one of the biggest revenue streams for churches has been just the average attender and giver. So, you've got some really interesting insights into what might help the average person think about giving to the local church. What would you say in lines of what are the giving triggers when it comes to giving in a local church?
Yeah, so for most churches, 80+% of their income comes through the gifts of individual givers. And so that's a significant source. And so to be able to connect with those individuals is important. Right when we went into this physical distancing, and the key piece for churches that they were thinking about was, what e-giving platform do I have? And I was actually surprised at the number of churches that reached out, because there are quite a few churches that don't have any e-giving options at all. And of course, if you can't meet in person, and that was your primary way of receiving those individual gifts, you're suddenly in a very bad spot. So there were a number of churches, that were seeking to do that. Now, thankfully, the greater percentage of churches already had some option available for them. The difficulty is that not most of their people were using them. And so what is true even for e-giving is that even with those churches that have e-giving, the actual act of giving still happens as part of worship. So, it's, if someone's making that text to give, or they're obviously using a kiosk at a church, or they're using some other electronic means, typically that's initiated because they're part of that act of worship, and the time of offering comes around, and so they are nudged to make their generous offering to the ministry of the church. And so
it's so interesting that you bring that up, because I think one of the selling points of e-giving that everybody uses is people could give anytime, but you're saying still generally for the average giver, it really is attached to that moment in worship. Is that because it's kind of like a key or a reminder to somebody, oh yeah, we need to support this place?
Yeah, there's definitely the reminder piece. And I think the basic truism is that people give when they're asked. So if you have any interactions with nonprofit organizations, you're probably well aware that they ask all the time, right? So they're consistently reaching out to their constituents, highlighting what it is they're doing, asking people to lean in and to support that. Now, churches have typically leaned on the offering as the time where that ask has occurred. But when you don't actually have that physical ritual act as part of your gathering, now you've got to think about how you do that differently. And so making sure that that is a component part of the way that churches are engaging with the members of their church is going to be important. They're going to need to be making that ask. And I'd also say that this is an opportunity for churches to think about how they incorporate that ask for generosity and support for the ministry of the church into all of the things that they do, so that whenever they're having some sort of content offering, whether it's a communication that's going out, or if they're doing some kind of gathering, virtual, that there's an opportunity there to encourage people to remember to support the ministry of the church, while also holding up the value that it does, because that's another key driver for giving. And particularly as you start looking at giving, as you go into generations like millennials, the impact that giving has is critical. They're not interested in supporting the church because they're members of the church. They're interested in supporting the church because it feeds people, because it welcomes the broken, because it has these different ministry components that make a difference in the world that they care about. And so lifting those up as well becomes very critical.
So what you're saying is it's almost like we need to make sure we're creating the space for it, but it's not enough to just say, hey, it's the offering time, you know what to do. And I thought you also brought up an interesting point. We talked a lot about making sure that space is in worship, but you're saying, no, create that space in more than just worship. So what are the best places we need to be asking? How do we need to be asking? And then who is the best person to be asking?
So when it comes to when to be asking, I would say any time that you are highlighting the impact that your church is having in ministry, that's a perfect place to raise up the opportunity. So if you're excited about the way that we're changing the lives of homeless youth, in our neighborhood, click here to support, our ministry efforts. Something along that line helps to raise up what it is that the church is doing, and then encourage the person to reach. Because if their heart is touched by what you're doing, then you have that increased likelihood that they'll take action to give. So that's probably the tie-in that I'd be looking for. We certainly don't want to become obnoxious in, the asking. And I'd also say we don't want to move into the fearfulness piece of asking of the sky is falling, we need you to give or our doors are going to close. Nobody feels particularly motivated if something feels like it's failing to want to shovel more resources towards something that they're not sure is actually going to be moving forward. So showing hopefulness, even if it is tied to a dose of reality of the challenges that we're facing and tying it to the real impact that we're having. This is why we're here. This is what we're doing. We have a mission to achieve, and you're part of it. And one of the ways that you're part of that is by helping to support us financially.
Yeah, I think that's huge, because I think any organization that came out to you and it constantly looked like they were fighting to keep the lights on, you may be saying, well, why in the world am I going to give to that? And the other thing I've heard, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this, is people don't give to the lights, they give to vision.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. So I grew up Lutheran, and I've belonged to a number of Lutheran churches as I've moved around in different roles and in different communities. When I've talked about millennials particularly, they are not interested in giving money to a museum for a pipe organ. Just to put that out there. And so if that's how they're viewing, like if they can't really see the power and the purpose behind why this community exists, it's not going to be something that's going to compel them to give. And I actually think that's true, in the Gen X space as well. And quite honestly, most people want to know that what they're contributing to is having good impact for that. So we really do have to get that mission out there of what it is that we're actually doing, and lives changed is very compelling. So when you can actually hold up an individual whose life is different, and wouldn't be different were it not for this community of believers in this place, I mean, that's compelling, and will get someone much more likely to say, I want to be a part of that.
That's huge. I've something that we've always kind of encouraged pastors. We do training with church planters is, don't just simply say, hey, we're doing this. Share the how, the what, and the why. And so I think, exactly with what you're saying, it's like, hey, let's not just say we're doing an offering. Hey, we're stepping into a time of offering. If you want to support, you go to this link right here. It's going to be in your streams. And then here's an incredible story of what happened through your support. And I love that idea too, that you're saying of giving that credit away, reminding people that they've invested in the impact the church is having. And I think people like to know they're a part of something bigger than themselves, especially, I'm bracketed in the grandpa millennial category. So I'm the oldest and wisest of my generation, which is scary when you think about it. But I really resonate with that. I don't want to just kind of prop a museum up. I would love to be a part of something that's making an impact. And that's one of the reasons I love personally to give to the church.
Quite honestly, I think that's why church workers go into the ministries that they go into. They want to make a difference as well, right? I mean, they want to see that gospel impact in the work that they do. And so it fires up people, around the whole enterprise.
And now I'm curious, before we move on past this conversation, because I love what you're saying here. What are some of those other auxiliary areas that you're talking about, encouraging people to support, and how do you see churches doing that well?
So when we're thinking about how people can contribute in, we need to be thinking very broadly about how people can support. So we've done at Thrivent, we've done research with the Barna Group around generosity. And one of the things that we've been trying to understand is how different generations think about generosity. And one of the interesting discoveries for us has been that there are really 5 different ways that people think about giving back. And oftentimes we think about that. As someone who's a former pastor, typically for pastors, when they think about generosity, the 2 things that come to mind for them first are financial giving, and the second is volunteer service. But when you look more broadly across the generations, providing gifts in kind is one. So non-financial gifts, I'm baking banana bread, and I'm going to bake an extra loaf and give it to a neighbor, type of thing. It's one where I have a garden that I'm growing and I have lots of extra vegetables. I'm going to share those with my neighbors. That's a form of generosity. It's not financial in nature. The next is hospitality, which is huge among millennials. In fact, the younger you are, the more likely you are to see hospitality as a primary form of generosity. And so this notion of having unconditional regard and welcome for individuals and wanting to bring them in. I mean, I think that fits really well into the evangelism aspect of what churches are called to do. And then the last is providing emotional and relational support. And like I said earlier, churches have been doing that for a long time, but we don't always often think about holding that up as a way that people can give back. So if we tie this together with the earlier question around, so what do we do with people who are struggling financially? If we can think about those 5 different ways of being generous and ask, how does that pour in to helping us continue to do the ministry of our church? How do we get people involved in providing emotional and relational support? How do we get people involved in this aspect of hospitality and so on? We have an opportunity to be able to feed the ministry of the church, as well as really tap into the motivations for why people want to give in the first place.
I think that's huge because, I'll never forget this story, especially when you're talking about reaching people outside the church. I think we don't recognize enough how our generosity is tied to that. And you were talking about the hospitality component. I had some friends, not necessarily like deeply connected to the church, but a big thing up here is when somebody's been having a baby, whether you're in the church or out of the church, people are bringing you meals. And they said, we had a group of friends that we weren't home. They broke into our house to put food into our refrigerator, and just the impact of that. And so I love how when you talk about, because I think we all default to that. We all default to giving just being about making the church budget happen, and not realizing that giving can also be tied to evangelism and how people see the church living out its faith. So I love the broader scope that Thrivent is really looking at when it comes to that side of it. So now, one thing we've kind of been dancing around a little bit, and I'd love to hear your insights on this, is who are the key people that need to be communicating about giving?
Who within the church?
Yes.
I would say any ministry leader needs to be communicating about giving and being part of the mission of the church. I think that's part of how we go about including people in any of the work that we're doing. So if we're operating a prayer ministry of some kind, or we're even doing a teaching ministry, some type of small group, people can give to help support that, and that can include financial giving, but they can also be giving in other ways. So what are the contributions that are going to be needed to make that happen? And some of that's giving of their time to be able to do some of the calls that need to be made, or reach out to individuals in need. So all members of the staff certainly need to be part of that effort. And it's certainly all of the lay leaders who are engaged in that would be part of that as well. And those members of your churches who are actually super passionate about what it is you're doing are also going to be incredible advocates to encourage others to give and to support what it is you're doing.
That's huge. I really appreciate you sharing on the income side. So let's talk expenses. We're 10 weeks in. As you said, 2/3 of churches or more are really experiencing a bit of a crunch. So what do churches need to continue to do on the budget side to be able to kind of prepare for, a season that really still for a lot of us is a big question mark on the end?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, so if we just look at budgets generally, so within most churches, and this comes from the National Study of Congregation Economic Practices that the Lake Institute released last year, but nearly 50% of a church's budget is focused on people, paying for staff. And then about just less than a quarter is focused on maintaining the facilities, which means that 25% of the budget is focused on everything else. So mission, contributions that you might give to a denominational organization or network that you're a part of, programmatic ministries. I mean, we actually spend very very little as a percentage of the budget there. In programmatic ministries, we typically spend one out of every $10 in that space. So one of the interesting things is churches are looking, particularly those who are wrestling with perhaps shortages of income. They're looking at, so where do we actually have savings? And the challenge is going to be that we typically feel like we don't have a lot of control over the facilities piece because the building is what the building is.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the staff, we're really hesitant to make a negative impact in the life of someone that we love and care about because they've been part of our ministry team. But the reality is those are the two places where we can where we have the greatest expenditure. And so even a small change there can actually result in greater dollars that are available to be able to make up for shortfalls. But obviously, every church is going to have to look at that on an individual basis to see what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I know we were doing little things like we just turned our heat off. So there's a few live streams where the staff, the few people in the building running the live stream are incredibly cold, but it was worth it just from a cost savings side.
There are some deferments that people can get as well. So there are many mortgage lenders, for example, and we have a mortgage lending area for church loans. If there are churches that are experiencing financial difficulties, there's opportunities to defer payments, so they just get tacked on to the end of the life of the loan. But it gives some breathing room. And in fact, there's some churches that we've worked with that have said, we're doing okay, but we actually just have a great need to reach out in ministry right now, and it'd be really great to have some of that money to address the unique needs that we're getting. So there are different ways that churches can put some of those resources to use. So it is important to look at those options, and certainly to be looking at where we can be cutting down on expenses. If this is the time of year where you make a large purchase of communion wine, for the year because you buy in bulk, well, maybe you're not doing that right now. Right. If you're not going to be meeting in person anytime soon, and of course that's going to vary around the country because different places will be opening at different timelines.
That's huge. Now, what other opportunities should churches be looking at, especially because you're talking about budgets that are already pretty thin. So churches aren't generally organizations that have huge profit margins to begin with when things are running normally. So a lot of them are trying to figure out, okay, maybe things are thin. Where are some other spots that people can either look to cut or maybe even add in revenue that they might not be thinking about initially?
So this comment will tie back into the giving piece as well. When you were asking, when and to whom do you ask to give? Many churches have one or a couple of flagship ministries that they offer that not only their members, but the community at large would see as valuable. So, I'm thinking about a church that I know in Manhattan, and it has a huge homeless youth shelter. That people in the neighborhood are going to care about that just as much as the members of the church are. So there are opportunities there to be thinking a bit more broadly around who you can invite in to support that. There have been churches in recent years who are also, they're looking at some of those ministries and asking, can we begin to separate those legally and structurally from the church into a separate 501c3? Because one, it creates another organization that can be requesting gifts to support. And oftentimes those independent 501c3s have the ability to tap into government or foundation grants that houses of worship often aren't qualified to get. And so it's a way of creating an access point to revenue that doesn't exist. Now, that's not going to solve anyone's immediate issue, right? Because that's going to take a lot of time to get something like that set up. But if you're looking at how do you structure for the future, that's one thing that you can be looking at. How do you begin to think about spinning off some of these ministries into their own independent units that can actually tap into other resources to support them.
Yeah, I know that was a big help for us, the fact that our early education center is its own 501c3 entity that partners with our church, because, just like you're saying, that enabled us to be able to do different things over there, to be able to just access help that we wouldn't have been able to access if we were just doing it as a church. So I think that's an incredible thing. And I think too, you bring up a really important point. I think sometimes if all we're looking at is the immediate pressure of our budget or our giving, and we're not asking the question, what can we be adding long-term, that's going to help us as we move past this? I do think it's a balancing act, because obviously, if you're not there in a year, it doesn't matter. But as you're balancing these things out, and as you're learning these things, you should be thinking about, how about the long-term health of the church? What could we be doing differently as we go forward, in the next 3 to 5 years, versus just the next 3 to 5 months?
And this kind of wise stewardship of the resources that we've been entrusted with, and thinking through that. And oftentimes within the Christian community with churches, we're often very much on a razor thin margin. And so it is a moment for us to begin to think about how we actually incorporate some of those wiser stewardship models into what we do. I mentioned earlier the number of churches that don't have an emergency savings fund, or don't have enough money stored up to even get them through a handful of months. And that's something that we say is true for individuals. It's also true for organizations, to have that money available. If we say individuals should have 4 to 6 months of income available to them for an emergency savings fund. If churches did the same thing, the conversation in a lot of places would be different right now. It would remove some of the anxiety, and because sometimes when we're making decisions and we're worried, we don't always make the best decisions, because we're distracted by those things. And so it gives us a little bit of breathing and cushion to be able to think through and make what are the wise decisions for us. And I think there's also opportunity for us to begin to ask how we might look at what our staffing model looks like, and whether there are long-term ways to think about our facility usage. There are opportunities now, and if there's one thing that we've proven with COVID-19 is that we have the ability to do a lot remotely. And so if we're looking at some of the staff that we're having in our churches, is there opportunity to share staff among churches that might do something very specialized that would allow us to be able to share that across? And we're finding out we can do things in remote ways where we can support that. So there may be ways for us to begin to think through, if we look at the totality of the staff that we might have among Christian churches in a particular community, or a specific judicatory, are there ways that we can share some of those so that we can reduce the expenses for the individual congregation and have something that's shared more broadly, and therefore the burden is shared?
Yeah, something as simple as, some of those administrative tasks, like churches that use bulletins, or just communications in general. It'd be very easy for a couple of churches to share a communications coordinator. And then, you're able to reap the benefits of that without, burdening the whole cost on.
And if you think about some of the financial pieces as well, so anyone who's had to recruit a financial secretary or a treasurer or something like that, I mean, heaven help us all, right? Like, that's one of the worst things to have to try and find, one who would want to do it, because it is involved, and two, has the expertise to be able to do it. But these days, and think about this as well in terms of having a membership management system for churches that can seem really out of the league for pricing for an individual church to have, particularly if it's a small to medium church. But if they're linked together, many of these systems are set up for multi-campus ministries now. And so you can actually utilize that functionality so that you can be sharing the same system, and you can then also be focusing into a resource that can do that, instead of trying to find that in 5 different places.
Oh, I think that's brilliant. So, and this is really kind of, spurring my mind here. I think you've answered a lot of great questions when it comes to giving triggers, when it comes to managing the budget. But as a self-proclaimed church nerd, what have been some of the most creative responses that you've seen over the last 10 weeks, whether it's churches that you're involved with, or just things that you've noticed from afar that you're like, hey, this is a really great idea that maybe some more churches could look at or implement?
So I think the thing that people have been doing most frequently that's been helpful is providing multiple times to gather through virtual connections that are still small group in nature. So many churches have moved to using Zoom or something like it in order to host worship. But getting people together just in small groups so that they can share with one another, there is this sense of social isolation that people have. And as much as we may love our families, sometimes we want to talk to someone else. We want to see a different face. And so churches that have been creating those opportunities for people to connect, and especially when they're able to do it in around likely pre-existing small groups that they've had. So I'm thinking about families who are at home right now trying to figure out how to help their kids with their schoolwork and maintain themselves if they're still working remotely from home. So there have been churches that have been linking together to learn from homeschooling groups, for example. So their intention may still be, for their church members, that their kids are going to go back to public school, but they can still learn from homeschoolers what it is that they need to be doing now in order to help create the right environment for their kids to be able to learn and focus on that. So reaching out to those partnerships and tapping to bring them in has been really fruitful in a number of places.
Well, I think that's brilliant too. And I know somebody's going to say, well, hey, what about Zoom fatigue? Because a lot of people are like, we have Zoom fatigue. Look, as a staff, we did something similar because we're like, look, we want to do something fun together. We've been meeting daily as a staff over the last 10 weeks. So we've had 50 staff meetings, if you can imagine that, over the last 10 weeks. So if you want to talk Zoom fatigue, there's some Zoom fatigue. We actually went on jackgames.tv. And you can get interactive games that you can play with people virtually. So we did a Zoom call and we had an interactive game that you play through the phone. It was so much fun to be able to interact. And it felt like we were interacting in a new way. So that's, another way that churches could get together. If you're trying to find ways to help people connect, there's another idea that you could do.
Absolutely. One of the things that I'd say with Zoom fatigue as well, so this is just me, sample size equals 1, from my own personal reflection. But when it comes to Zoom fatigue, what I think the real issue that people are wrestling with is being watched. Like that's the part that is exhausting. So give your church members the opportunity to just turn their camera off. Let them, get together, almost treat it like a conference call as opposed to a video call. You can still use all of the graphics and things that you put up on the screen, but people don't have to feel like they're being watched because that does get to be wearing after a while. And even at work, with my colleagues, we have different individuals on different days are just like, nope, camera's off today. I'm not ready for prime time. And, and so they're still there, they're still listening, they're still participating, but they're removing that burden of feeling like they're under the microscope.
And then, this is a good question for you. As we're getting ready to close this out, thank you, one, for just the time that you've given and the insights that you're sharing. What are some things that Thrivent is doing, whether it's for the individual Christian or whether it's for churches as whole to help kind of process and get through this season that we're living through?
So one of the principles that we adopted really early was go virtual or postpone, don't cancel. So we had a bias against canceling anything. And that really helped drive creativity for people saying, okay, we're committed to doing this. How are we going to get this done given our, the current restrictions that we have? And that's enabled us to actually move a lot of things to virtual in a really quick way. So we continue to do a lot of different types of activities. Obviously, all of our financial education pieces, we're making sure that we're doing those in virtual ways so that if people want to join in, and learn about building a values-based budget, or they want to learn about Social Security or something like that, we have those opportunities available for them. And then we're also, through our Thrivent member networks, creating other types of events. So we have one that focuses on yoga that people are doing. We've had book clubs that have been on. So we believe it's really important to be invested in one another. So we're creating some of those opportunities for us to be a part of that. So, at Thrivent.com, if you search for our Thrivent member networks, you can find a map that'll lead you to the geographic area where you are. Although these days that doesn't matter because everything's virtual, so you can join in with something in California, even if you're in Mississippi. So, take a look there and see some of the things that are being offered. There's certainly a lot of financial education that's there because that's what our expertise is. But we also have a number of other activities where we're just trying to create opportunities for people to connect with one another, learn, maybe let a little pressure off the valve so that they can continue to move through the current reality.
Which I'm glad you brought up that financial education piece, because one of the best ways to help things to educate people financially. I think a lot of times when we do our giving, we make it all about me, and so it's like, hey, the church needs this, the church needs this. And we forget that, if Americans are wrestling with debt, if Americans don't have savings accounts, we're called as a church, not just to receive from people, but to give to people. And so being able to give some great biblically centered financial counseling and courses is a great way to help see the bottom line of your church move up, because you'll be setting your people up to be better stewards of the resources God's given them.
Absolutely. I often say that the greatest benefit that Thrivent brings to churches is financially healthy Christians. So if we can help more Christians be financially healthy, that'll have an incredible impact on the ability of those Christians to support the churches and the ministries that they care so much about.
Wow. So, and you guys are continuing to do things like Thrivent Choice Dollars and
Thrivent Action Teams.
Continue to do those programs as well?
Yeah. So
yes.
Thrivent Choice continues to be available to members who have the dollars to be able to direct. But we also have, for any organization that's enrolled in Thrivent Choice, we have a personal donations page that offers fee-free giving, so people can support those organizations that are already in our catalog and know that 100% of their gift is going to support that organization. We also occasionally do special challenges. We had a challenge around supporting organizations during COVID-19 and saw $5 million raised.
Wow.
To be able to support that. So Thrivent Action Teams continue to be available. And we've got some tips out there for how you can do virtual volunteering, so that there are ways that you can actually still make a difference without having to worry about, navigating in this time of social distancing.
Oh, that's huge. Jan, thank you so much for taking the time. If you guys want to connect with Jan, we're going to have his info linked on a PDF follow-up that we're going to send out to you. So if you're on this webinar, we've got the PDF follow-up that we're going to send out, as well as if you enjoyed the content here and you want to share that with somebody else. I know a lot of times we do these things during the day, and that's probably not the ideal time for a volunteer-led church finance team. So just know you can take the same link. We'll email you out a link that you can use to then watch this on demand with your church finance team, and you can share it with whoever you like. Anybody you think it's going to be helpful for, we're happy to share that out with you. And if it's okay, Jan, I'd love to just pray with you and for everybody that's doing the webinar right now as we head out. Awesome.
Great.
Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much that you've just allowed so much creativity and so much partnership to come in the church. Lord, thank you for what you're doing. Be with us in the midst of navigating the finances of the church, Lord. And I pray that you would help us use the gifts that you've given to be a blessing to the world around us. Lord, thank you for the gifts of Jan and for his willingness to share. And just pray that you continue to guide and strengthen us each step of the way. It's in your name, Lord Jesus, and by your strength we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Jan, thanks a bunch.
Thanks for having me on.